Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. The movers of the world, the producers, the people who do all of the innovations that make the world run, they all decide to go on strike to stop the looters, the people who are insisting that they work for the good of society, and they insist on working for their own self-interest. This book was published in 1957, and it's still controversial today. But I think it helps to go back to why this book was written and who is the person who wrote it. Ayn Rand was born in Russia when they still had a czar, and she saw the takeover of Stalin and the crushing of individual liberties in the name of the good of the state. And she saw that as the most repellent, evil, soul-crushing thing that she's ever seen. And so she lived her life against that. She was able, by some miracle, to get to the United States, and by even some greater miracle, got a screenwriting job when she happened to meet Cecil B. DeMille. So it's a crazy story of how she got to be a screenwriter for Hollywood, but there she was. So she started writing these philosophical books, expounding on her philosophy of individualism. And it all culminated in this book, her magnum opus. So people accuse this book of being all about selfishness, and I can't help but think they're slightly missing the point of the book. And I would wonder if you would think the poem Invictus is all about selfishness. I'm the master of my fate, I'm the captain of my soul. This book, I think, is more of a stand against the idea of living without using your mind, without thinking. It's like you're living a life that someone else has set up for you, and seeing that as a virtuous thing. So in this book, there are two kinds of characters, the good guys and the bad guys. And it is pretty clear as you're reading it, which characters are good and which characters are bad. The good guys understand the importance of producing and the morality of acting with your mind and seeing to your own self-interest. And the bad guys are the ones who think that everyone needs to live for everyone else. I think Atlas Shrugged is a novel where there are very obvious pros and very obvious cons. The very obvious pros are the interesting ideology. I think it's amazing how she crams so much of her philosophy into this book through the way the characters move around, through the dialogue of the characters. And the dialogue, I think, is one of the strong points in a sense. I think when there are certain dialogue exchanges in this book that I find fascinating, like between James Taggart and his wife when they're talking about what love is and whether it's selfish or selfless, or the conversation between Ragnar Daneskjold and Hank Rearden about Robin Hood. Like I love some of these conversations where she tackles an interesting angle from her central premise. But basically all of the conversations are like a spider diagram around a central speech that comes at the end of the book, where John Galt gives this big speech on the radio broadcast. And basically all the other conversations of the whole book are directly attached to that in some way. I think another obvious strength of the book is the grandness of the world that she created. She gets into specifics about how the railways work, how the ore mining, oil, coal, like how this economy works. It seems just well-researched and interesting, and it kind of draws you in to how these things operate. And also, I really like the evolving mystery that they have, because at one point they find this extremely efficient engine that was abandoned for some reason, so the main characters are trying to track down like who made this engine, where did they go. And I think she does a good job of maintaining the suspense from these characters going from one place to the next, trying to figure it out. On the bad side, I said I liked a lot of the conversations. A lot of the conversations are somewhat repetitive, and the conversations where you have the good guy talking directly to the bad guy is a particularly repetitive and a bit heavy-handed. You have the bad guy saying something like, well, surely you don't just care about money, and then the good guy says, well, actually I do just care about money, and then the bad guy does some pearl clutching something. Anyway, it gets kind of silly and repetitive after a while. I think that's my main complaint. You have very flat villains. You're not really challenged by any of their ideas. So their defeat in the end just seems obvious, and you kind of walk your way to the ending and it just makes sense, but it's not particularly noteworthy. I do think it's interesting to reread this book occasionally just because it's still relevant, I find, in a lot of ways. Sometimes I hear people in Congress talk in a way that sounds like the villains from Atlas Shrugged. And there's this part of me that can't help but wonder, maybe they're actually a big fan of Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged, and they are such a big fan that they decide they're going to play the villains and make the Atlas Shrugged into a reality. And so I imagine them going home and laughing at this big joke they're pulling off. I guess we'll never know whether or not that's true, but it's a fun thought experiment when I hear certain people sometimes. Anyway, so it's a long and fascinating read. I recommend it just because I think it's interesting to talk about how things apply or don't apply, what she did right, what she did wrong in her philosophy, in her novel writing. There's a lot of great discussion points here, so I enjoyed it. This is one of the most impossible books to actually give a star to, so I'll just go in the middle of where these pros and cons end up and give it a 4. 4 stars.